Today we're going to be covering a boatload of tips, tricks and theories on how Jim and Scott created that rendering back in the good old days of the 90s. This includes multidirectional hatching, common lighting, rendering males and females, and also different materials such as chrome and visors. I'll be covering all this in a logical order today, because as you may know, Jim takes the usual comic art rules, mixes them all up, makes nonsense out of them, but I'm trying to put them together to make some sort of sense for us mere mortals. So I'd recommend that you watch all of these chapters in order, because the methodology and the terminology are both going to be explained and build upon one another. Otherwise, you might get royally confused. As always, if you like this video, let me know in the comments, and if you want to see more, consider subscribing. If you want to see more of Jim Lee's X-Men, maybe VFX or layouts, let me know in the comments below. And I'll be looking for artists to cover next, so if you have a favourite artist you want me to do a deep dive on, let me know. Enough intro, let's dig in. Step 1. Feathering. So first up, we have to talk about feathering. And with this, it's super important that you're very mindful and purposeful about what you do with your strokes. Be it the spacing, the length, the taper, and the direction, they all need to have a purpose. One example is strokes could be gradually changed to be bigger or smaller, such as this example of Wolverine's brows. But change needs to be done with a purpose, and in this case, a gradual tightening is done to indicate a furrowed brow. But in the same panel, we can see it is also used to indicate an area going into darkness or light, such as his mask. With this in mind, each section or panel has its own direction, spacing, and length rules, all relative to one another. If we compare Wolverine's mask compared to his forehead, they are two different areas that have two different sets of spacing, direction, and length. But they are able to coexist in the same panel despite being different, because they are A, consistent, B, not completely dissimilar to one another in terms of length, direction, taper, or spacing. If you're cross-hatching strokes, they're haphazardly done, and what I mean by this is if it's not done with purpose and mindfulness, if they're shorter then longer then medium then shorter and over, you're on a one-way street to big rendering problems. Step 2. Terminators. So the definition of a terminator is very simple. Shadows can't exist in pure light, so there has to be some sort of border where shadows can suddenly exist. If we have a quick look at these examples, you can clearly see, hopefully, that the Terminator is in action. Like any good Terminator though, they will fight back. Details such as lip texture, stubble, sweat, and tears can create new, tiny Terminator borders and create little shadows underneath. And that's what we can see here. One very cool Terminator detail is on this picture of Magneto, where if we zoom in, we can see that the stubble has actually been rendered in negative space because of the Terminator line. How cool is that? Step 3. Core and cast shadows. This is super important in Jim and Scott's work, and in comic art in general, so I'm going to do my very best to try and explain all of the intricacies. A core shadow is any person, object, or thing that is being lit with a directional light, and where that light can't reach, a core shadow is then created. The easiest, most visual explanation of this is if we light somebody from the front, like Cyclops and Beast here, we can see that their hair is in shadow. Now, if we take that object or thing and put it in front of something else, and it casts a shadow onto that thing, that newfound shadow is called a cast shadow. One important rule, both in Jim and Scott's work and in comic art in general, is that typically cast shadows don't have rendering from the outline of the shadow's edge. We can see this distinction in this image of Magneto. Notice that the cast shadow shapes have a straight outline and don't have any cross-hatching coming outwards from those shapes. Now if we look at the core shadows, we can clearly see that they have feathering emanating from them. Now, you might be thinking, why am I explaining all this? Because in Jim's world, shadows are split into many different types of beasts. Not those beasts, these beasts. We have the typical shadows that are very common in comics in general, which are filled with black, and then we have parallel lined core shadows, parallel lined cast shadows, and then some shadows that are a mix of everything. Let's dig into these one by one. Let's start with parallel core shadows. They are typically used on the body or lower extremities to make areas look like they are fading away. This can be fading into the distance, into an environmental factor such as fog or smoke, which coincidentally tends to hide feet, or to give them a bit more depth and help break up the pose. Parallel cast shadows, however, are typically found on the face, particularly on the nose or under the eyes from the brow, casting a shadow down. It's worth noting that on extreme close-ups, that use of parallel cast shadows, he will avoid repetition by using the planes of the anatomy as separate sections, and then differentiate the strokes between them. If there are two different parallel lines that are overlapping, he will switch the direction of strokes, as we can see with the nose and eye cast shadows here. Sometimes Jim likes to use all of the above on one character in one panel. If we look at this image of Rogue, we can see a clear defined outline of the ordinary cast shadow that then emerges into the parallel core shadow, which takes some confidence to pull off. Step 4. Bounce lighting. Now that we have a good understanding of different shadow types and Terminators, let's have a look at the most quintessential 90s lighting, bounce lighting. In X-Men, it comes into two different categories. Both use two different lights with two different light temperatures, which is basically just light colour from two different directions. The difference between these two techniques is that one uses a very clear and prominent Terminator and the other does not. The most easily recognisable of the two is the one most typically used on faces and torsos that we can see here. It is created by turning an ordinary core shadow into a parallel core shadow and then colouring behind with a different light temperature, so it gives it a distinct and separate look. It's worth noting though, although this looks cool as heck, you should only really use it sparingly, and the reason being is that overuse takes away some of that cool factor and it can end up just looking overused. The second type of bounce lighting we're going to talk about could also be known as a rim light, where a light is creating a highlighted Terminator across a person, a face, or part of their anatomy. When this occurs, there is a clear Terminator around the edge, and the light is a different colour temperature from the main light to help distinguish it apart. Step 5. Stroke shapes. Believe it or not, there are some common crosshatching shapes that Jim uses throughout his work, both on bodies and faces. So let's break them down one by one, when and how to use them. Big contour arching squiggles are used as sort of a rendering Terminator. As we can see here in this image of Beast and Gambit, Jim uses squiggles to end a section of rendering where that area will then be going into light. Notice that the height of the squiggles change between character, with Gambit's being much higher than Beast's. On Beast, the height or points of these wiggly lines correspond with the contour or the form of the muscle, rather than pointing towards the light. There are also the little brother, the little squiggle lines, that have the same sort of rendering Terminator use, which are often used on cheekbones or on the forehead. The reason I call these squiggles rather than just ordinary crosshatching is that they look so wavy and obviously joined together like a wave, which I think separates them apart. Next up, on faces in particular, he uses a sort of almost closed oval shape to indicate wrinkles, crinkles, and crow's feet. Speaking of faces, you're probably very bored of me saying this, but women very rarely have any rendering on their faces. But if you're Jim Lee, and if you were to do rendering on their faces, if you do one line, it could be seen as a mistake. However, he always doubles down and does 2 or 3, and then it becomes a Jim Lee technique rather than a mistake. Moving on, we also have the humble tapered flick, as we can see in this image. There is a surprising collection of different tapered flicks we can see. These are created by first knowing where your light source is, and then using the contour of the muscle to bend the tapered shape into the light source. As always with Jim, he likes to not be repetitive and mixes and matches his tapered strokes for added dynamics. The most surprising of these to me is the cross-hatching on the side of Cyclops' stomach, where the lines almost have no taper and change from thick to thin almost immediately. We can see from the colouring this could be to indicate a harder shadow and to avoid repetition with so much of his front already being in shadow. You're gonna say hello? That coffee is not for you. Hey, oh, you're gonna scratch my chair, that's nice. It's very kind of you. Where was I? In the bottom circle of his pectoral, if you look closely, you can see that his hatching correlates with the previous squiggle line we talked about, whereby the highest points serve to anchor and connect to the hatching, which flows across the chest. These hatching lines don't actually match the thickness of those squiggle lines. They are thinner to create a more of a distinction and a hierarchy of shadow where thicker is more powerful. Moving on to the smaller stroke shapes, across mainly the legs in males, you can find tiny tapered flicks which are used to hint at muscle. As we can see with Magneto's legs here, Jim has added a lot of rendering to the bottom section of the thigh, so instead of adding more rendering and verging on over-rendering, he adds detail to the contours of the muscles by adding flicks, sometimes with an underlying vertical line to give extra definition. Step 6. Multidirectional Crosshatching. Now that hopefully you have a good understanding of Jim Lee's lighting, shadows and stroke shapes, let's get on to that famous Jim Lee multidirectional crosshatching. Multidirectional crosshatching is when you have two or more layers of crosshatching that are overarching and overlapping each other on any given person or object. The important thing is, it's only used in core shadows. Let's have a look at a very common example of this, the male shoulder. We can see that Jim has a tendency to create tapered crosshatching strokes that follow the form of that shoulder. He even goes so far as to include crosshatching that would include striations in the muscle, which is pretty cool. So you're probably asking me, well, how do I go about doing this for my own work? Well, let's get into it. If we have another look, we can see that Jim creates lines around the shape horizontally that bend to follow the form. And then around 45 degrees relative to the previous area, he will add the other directional crosshatching on top. But there's some common rules to think of. The closer to the light source both of these directional areas go, the lighter the strokes become, and sometimes the strokes actually break up into multiple pieces, as if the light is already eaten away at that rendering. You might now be asking me, well, I know about shoulders, but where else can they be used? And the answer is, anywhere that there is a core shadow, but it comes with some caveats. You've probably already guessed this one, but it's rarely ever used on females. When it is used, it's only ever used on large areas of anatomy, such as shoulders, pectorals, biceps, faces, and heads. Areas that have a large amount of space in a panel. Otherwise, that layered crosshatching can very quickly make it look messy, cramped, or worst of all, smudged into pure black. And then in the smaller areas, use different various parallel and squiggly lines instead. Step 7. Common lighting. 9 times out of 10, Jim will light characters from the top left of the panel or the character's right hand side, if they're facing the viewer, if that makes sense. And if your name is Magneto, you'll also nearly always have a very intense light, mainly because you're always causing so much drama. The more drama or emotion that is stirring in the story, the harsher the lighting becomes. Characters that ordinarily would have the softest of lights, such as Rogue and Jean, can be seen to have more core shadow detail than normal. Although it is noted, it is never as strongly detailed as the males in these dramatic situations. Step 8. Male materials. Now it's come for the time for us to put all we've learned so far onto drawing males. And surprisingly, different types of materials, particularly spandex, are rendered differently. So let's have a look. One of the rules today is that characters with lighter coloured suits typically have less rendering. The rendering then becomes more intense the darker the suit becomes, as we can see with Magneto and Cyclops, until eventually the rendering actually inverts and you are creating crosshatching with non-black areas such as Gambit. And this chap, one thing I've noticed that Jim does to give characters depth and definition is he will use a rim light that ordinarily in the physical world wouldn't exist. So let's have a look. As we can see here, we have a lighter suit and a darker suit to compare these rim lights. On Cyclops, we can see that the inner part of his right arm has a very clear rim light, and considering the front of his chest is in so much shadow, this rim light shouldn't really exist. However, because it is there, it helps give a distinct shape to his arm. Without that rim light, that much black would make his arm blend in too much and he would lose a lot of definition. This rim light continues down the left side of his right arm and also down the left side of his leg. What is interesting and why this works is because it's used sparingly and only on the side where that main light source is. Let's have a look at Wolverine for a more subtle understanding. As we can see, the more prominent rim is on the top of his back and his shoulders, where it actually gives detail to his deltoid and back muscles. As we move down, we can see that the majority of his chest is in shadow, but a rim is given to his pectorals, his serratus, and his lats. Again, if these were in shadow, A, those parts wouldn't stand out due to being in shadow, and B, Wolverine himself would not stand out so much against such a busy background. Moving on down again, we can see on his right arm, his wrist guard, to me, looks to be a different material. Something more metal, due to the texturing. And with that in mind, the rim itself becomes much bigger as it would with a more metallic texture, as it becomes much more reflective. I think it's cool that he again details the inner forearm muscles by adding small Terminators to give definition. Further down Wolverine, the Terminator becomes less prominent, but we can still see a hint of it in action on his right thigh, which is the only one that is in a direct light source. When a character's costume is either black or close to it, he flips the rendering on its head. Instead of using dark, he uses light colours to carve out definition. Gambit's pants, or trousers for our American friends, are a very dark colour, so the rendering is a lot less detail. And he uses broad, sweeping lines muscle definition instead. You'll notice that Jim doesn't go absolutely ham with the rendering on these characters. He prefers to keep it minimal and much thicker lines than usual. To create less repetition in all characters, male or female, he often breaks up the rendering with a mix of highlight spots. They can either be loose ovals or spiky highlights, and the placement is always toward the light source and overrides the render lines, creating new Terminators. Step 9. Female materials. You're probably going to guess what I'm going to say. Yes, women have less rendering on their suits. However, there's still things to explore and to learn from, so let's go. Just like with men, lighter suit colours again have less rendering, as we can see here with Rogue and Jean. Storm, of course, is the outlier, because her suit must be extra shiny, which equals extra rendering. The most surprising to me is the amount of detail that Jim will give female necks. I probably naively assumed that he would sort of stray away from the tendons and harsh shapes, but he doesn't. He still creates a lot of shape and definition. He just keeps it to basic shapes with little to no crosshatching. Going down the body, we can see that Jim uses rim lights, again, to give specific emphasis to female chests, giving them more depth and height. There are commonalities to shadows on the underside of their chests, whereby he will use sweeping parallel core shadows going horizontally across. These will be broken up by splitting the shadows to each underside shape, and of course utilising the rim as a boundary line. The most defined area on women in terms of muscle rendering is their forearms, whereby Jim loves to emphasise striations down the forearm. This is where the muscle rendering starts and stops though, as there is little to no rendering on the bicep or the deltoids. Legs on women is where things get a little bit more complicated though. For characters wearing darker suits, Jim doesn't focus on muscle definition like he does with males. He instead focuses on, again, using rim lights and long sweeping vertical shapes to make their legs look extra long. It's also good to note that there is very little feathering, and when it is, it's very narrow. There is an outlier though, in that Psylocke's leg materials are typically seemingly made of chrome, so I will be covering that shortly. Step 10. Male and female comparison. I don't know about you, but I find it super handy to have visual comparisons. So here, I've taken the most heavily rendered male and the most heavily rendered female to compare the two, so we can see where their key differences and the key similarities are. As we can see, both characters have subtle chest rims, like we've already talked about, but Rogue has far less rendering in general, and instead uses a series of crease lines and stretch marks to emphasise the planes of her chest. Moving down, we can see there is very little definition is given to female abs in comparison, which, as we learned in our dynamic figures video, is not unusual for Jim. However, both Cyclops and Rogue's arms are heavily rendered and have similar emphasis put onto forearm striations, and both use heavy light rims in this area. Around the crotch area, we can see on both characters the very common parallel core shadows that we now know so well, with Rogue's being longer, as Jim has always emphasised female hips being long. As we can see on the thighs, this is where another stark difference is had, like I've spoke about before. Jim loves to render intricate muscles bulging on men's thighs, whereas on women, he doesn't give any emphasis to muscles in particular. Long sweeping render lines to make their legs look extra long instead. Towards the ankle is one of my favourite Jim Lee isms. He creates a sweeping bend from the knee to the ankle that bends inwards. And this is seen on both men and women and can be accomplished by adding 3 to 5 parallel lines connecting to the ankle. Step 11. Materials, visors. Now we'll be moving on to the first of the non-organic materials. We'll be talking about visors that are reflective or shiny. They tend to have significant rendering, which tends to go in just one direction, and if there are multiple people in a scene, he will vary them ever so slightly to give differentiation. To break up the rendering, he uses a mix of spiky highlight spots and ordinary oval shapes to indicate the light direction, as if they were reflecting the light source. And as with most glass or reflective materials, he uses a rim terminator on the outermost side to imitate refraction. And before you come at me, I'm not a science person. I think it's called refraction. It might not be. Please let me know. Step 12. Materials, chrome. Colossus fans everywhere, rejoice. It is his time to shine. Even if he was only in it for 3 panels or whatever in issue 1, we'll be talking about chrome. The easiest way to explain how to draw chrome is to imagine a dark reflection has been stretched out over the form in any given direction. These reflections rarely ever touch the side because of refraction, and typically ended with the little squiggle render shape we learned earlier. To adhere to our old rule of not being repetitive, we use these stretched out lines in a feathered fashion, which means that we're going to be going from dark to light, and break up the area of the whole with either muscle definition or contour lines that circle around the whole form. Chrome is also used on areas such as shoulder pads quite commonly, where we see the previous rules in play, the only difference being is there are no muscles, so the render lines are typically horizontal or diagonal.
Step 13. Materials, capes.
When it comes to capes, it shouldn't be any surprise that Jim uses a heck of a lot of lines. However, for the time, it sort of still is a bit of a surprise. So let's get into it. The reason being, his core shadows in capes don't rely on heavy use of spot blacks. He instead uses those pesky parallel core shadow lines. A lot. These parallel lines are used to tell both the core shadows and to emphasise the folds. In true Jim style, he breaks up these core shadows with a sprinkling of organic shapes, which sort of have no easily seen logic to them.
Step 14. Extreme lighting.
This panel was one of the first panels I saw that truly blew my mind. So, let's have a deep dive. The light Terminator is at its most extreme here. It's as if the light is so glaringly bright, it's swallowing the actual forms. The objects that are closer to the light become more feathered and disjointed from one another. As we can see in the hands of these two people, and the spaceship in front, notice that there isn't a clear defined outline to the characters, and instead it's a shadowy jigsaw using blocks of black to piece everything together into the scene. To help give shape to these blocks, he uses contour lines of the suit for crosshatching and keeps to a relatively even distance between the strokes. You may think and be asking me, why are there lines on the back of their suits? Well, it could be that the light is so bright that it's bouncing behind and hitting the back of the suit. Or because it just looks cool, I don't know. I know this video isn't about backgrounds, but you may not have realised there is literally nothing in the background of this panel. It's again because of that all-encompassing light, creating a wonderful composition tool, making us focus on the blocks of shape that tell the story. Similar to before, Magneto, sometimes when he uses powers, has that same lighting technique. So let's have a little look. The way these shapes are created is, imagine if there was an extreme light coming from the palm of your hand. That light would be so bright it would create little Terminator points on the back of your fingers, which is how this is created. It's worth noting that all hands have wrinkles on the palm, so adding in a few detail lines where those wrinkles are creating tiny little Terminators helps give shadow and definition to the shape of the hand. That's it, that's the rendering covered, at least for a start. There's probably a lot more that I could say about it, to be honest, but I'm trying to keep it somewhat concise. If you'd like to financially support the channel, there is some detail below as to how you can do that. It goes from very cheap and free to the more expensive options, but there is no pressure. If you have a favourite artist that you want me to cover and do a deep dive series like this, please let me know. I'd love to know what sort of artists people want me to cover. Until next time, keep on sketching.